Hello, and welcome to the introduction to Masechet Menachot. Masechet Menachot and Masechet Zvachim, which we just concluded, are what's often called sister tractates that complement one another. They both deal with sacrifices, but Zvachim deals with offerings from animals, from living creatures, and Menachot deals with offerings from plant produce. So grains like wheat or barley, and libations of wine and oil. And in fact, although these tractates are two separate tractates, we can see them as part of one unit. And many of the discussions run in parallel in both tractates. For instance, the very first Mishnah is very, very similar in Masechet Menachot and in Masechet Zvachim. So the first Mishnah says, Kol ha-menachot shenikmitzu shelo lishman, kshirot. All meal offerings that were taken with a kmitza, with a handful, not for their own sake, shelo lishman, are valid. Ela shelo alu lebalim mishum chova. But they don't count for their owners as fulfilling their obligations. Chutz miminchat choteh uminchat knoot, except for the sinner's meal offering and the meal offering of jealousy, which is brought as part of the sotah ritual. And for those who have learned Masechet Zvachim, this Mishnah immediately rings a bell because it's parallel to the first Mishnah of Masechet Zvachim, which says, Kol ha-zvachim shenizbechu lishman, all animal offerings that were slaughtered not for their own sake, kshirim, they're valid, ela shelo alu lebelim l'shem chova, but they do not count for the owners as fulfilling their obligation, chutz min ha-pesach u'min ha-chatat, except for the Passover offering and the sin offering. So we can see how these two Mishnayot are obviously built in parallel, and they discuss also the same central idea of shelo lishman, right? The idea of sacrificing not for its own sake. What does that mean? It means exactly as in Zvachim, that a priest offered one type of offering but had in mind a different type. So for instance, in Masechet Menachot, when we're talking about plant offerings, then we'll see that there are different offerings. We'll talk about them in a moment. There's Masechet, there's Machvat, Minchat Masechet, Minchat Machvat. So let's say a priest offered a Minchat Masechet, but he intended it as a Minchat Machvat, for example. And just as the Mishnah is parallel between Menachot and Zvachim, similarly, the Sugya in the Talmud also is very, very similar. And in fact, at the beginning of chapter 2, in a discussion of Pigul, the rabbis ask, Umay shnat mizevach, what is different from an animal offering? Meaning, why do we have to have this discussion all over again? Isn't it just the same as an animal offering? So the rabbis themselves recognize the parallels between these two systems. And as we'll see, there are many, many similarities, but there are also some differences. So just as with animal sacrifices, meal offerings can also be divided into different kinds of categories, and we won't go into too much detail because it will become confusing. All in all, there are 15 different kinds of menachot, of meal offerings. But we can divide them into obligatory offerings versus voluntary offerings. There are individual offerings versus communal offerings. And there are certain kinds of special offerings as well, such as the showbread, the lechem apanim, the omer, the shtei halechem, the two loaves, and other kinds of special meal offerings that are brought in special circumstances or at special times. But also standard meal offerings can be grouped by how they're prepared. So for example, we have minchat machvat, which is a pan-baked offering, versus minchat malcheshet, which is a kind of deep pan. It's somewhere between baking and cooking. Most menachot are brought as matzah, meaning they're flat, they don't rise. But some menachot are allowed to rise, and then they become chametz. Most menachot are brought on their own, but some come together with animal offerings. So as we go through the Masechet, it's important to notice when we come to each different kind of offering and to think about it, is this obligatory or is it voluntary? Is this an individual mincha or is it communal? Which way is it cooked? Is this matzah? Is this chametz? Okay, so again, altogether there are 15 different types of menachot, and we have to pay attention to the different aspects of each mincha. Another parallel to zvachim is that some parts of the mincha are burned on the altar and some parts are eaten by the priests. And importantly, as this will be a big part of the Masechet, is that just as in Zvachim, the sacrificial procedure is divided into 4 stages, similarly also in Menachot, there are 4 stages. So in Zvachim, we had slaughter, shchita, receiving the blood, kabbalat hadam, conveying the blood, holacha, and sprinkling, zlikat hadam. And in Menachot, similarly, we also have 4 stages. We have kmitza, taking a handful of the offering, which is parallel to shchita, to slaughter. We have matan b'kli sharet, placing it in a sacred vessel, which is parallel to receiving the blood in zvachim. We have holacha, conveying, which is the same, the 3rd step, both in zvachim and in menachot. And we have haktara, burning on the altar, which is parallel to zlikat hadam, to sprinkling in zvachim. And importantly, in all 4 of these stages, an improper intention, machshava, generally disqualifies the meal offering. But there's also differences between zvachim and menachot. For example, and importantly, all of the meal offerings, all of the menachot are considered kodshei kodashim, the highest level of sanctity, and they're eaten only by priests within the temple precincts. So that's different from zvachim, where we have kodashim and we have kodshei kodashim. And in menachot, all of the sacrifices are considered kodshei kodashim. Another difference is that shchita, slaughter, can be done by a non-priest, by a zal, and does not have to be performed by a priest, whereas kmitza must be performed by priests. So we can see that there's a kind of higher, menachot in a way seem to be on a higher level than zvachim, which I think seems often counterintuitive, right? We would think that an animal sacrifice, that's the classic sacrifice. It's also much more expensive. While menachot are, just this kind of addition, or it's the poor man's sacrifice. It's not the real thing, right? But we see here that Chazal are actually making a point that menachot are kodshei kodashim, and they can only be brought by priests, and they can only be eaten by priests. So we'll get back to that at the end to ask why this is so. Also, it's important to notice that in animal offerings, the whole procedure is only those 4 central services. In menachot, in meal offerings, there are also 2 preparatory steps of hagasha and tnufa. Hagasha is bringing close to the altar, and this is true only for some meal offerings. Tnufa, waving or lifting the offering. And so there seem to be additional steps to menachot, which are expanding the service of the menachot in comparison to zvachim. And the commentators ask, is this actually a part of is this part of the core services, right? Or is this just something else? So are menachot really something like zvachim, or are they something that's different from zvachim? But again, we can see here too that there seem to be additional steps that the rabbis are adding to menachot and expanding upon, making them in a way more developed, more steps, more rulings than zvachim. The structure of the tractate is divided into 3 parts. We already mentioned that a shared feature of zvachim and menachot is the intensive focus not only on the valid offerings, but also on invalid offerings, right? How does an offering become disqualified through an improper thought, a thought of pigul or other improper thoughts. So all the topics we met in Zvachim about machshava and pigul are relevant here too. And it can also help us to see the basic structure of the Masechet, because just as in Zvachim, the Masechet actually starts first with the problems, with the situations of b'diavad, the situations of a meal offering that something went wrong and something is problematic, and is it disqualified or isn't it disqualified? That's true for Menachot as well. And the first three chapters of Menachot deal with disqualifications in the service. So the improper intent, the intent shelo lishman, not for its own sake, the question of pigul, what happens if a non-priest sacrificed the offering, what happens if a meal offering was offered not according to all its rules. For instance, it wasn't mixed properly, it wasn't poured properly. Okay, so this is all the situations of when things go wrong. So that's the first part of the tractate. We'll talk in a moment about the second part, but the third part of the tractate finally deals with how exactly you are supposed to bring the meal offering. So what are the procedures that make the meal offering valid? How is it offered? What must be brought? How to mix the flour and the oil together? How to do the kmitzah, the taking a handful, how to burn it. Okay, and then also there's several chapters which deal with unique offerings, the Omer, the Shtei Alechem, the two loaves, the Thanksgiving loaves, and so on and so on. So that's the first part and the third part of the tractate. What happens in the middle? In the middle, we have a kind of a tractate within a tractate, or even we could say we have three tractates within a tractate. Because from the end of chapter 3 and throughout chapter 4, the Mishnah and following that, the Talmud discuss two major areas that are not discussed anywhere else in the Talmud. The laws of stam writing, the writing of a sacred text, so especially tefillin and mezuzah. Each of those has a whole unit dedicated to it, kind of a mini tractate about tefillin, a mini tractate about mezuzah, and finally another mini tractate about the laws of tzitzit. And each of these kind of bring together all the laws and also agadah about each of these three subjects. So again, the first three chapters discuss disqualification. Chapter 4 discusses these three mini tractates. And then the second half of the Masechet, from chapter 5 till the end, discusses the proper procedures for making a meal offering valid. We talked about the first Mishnah of the tractate. I want to also discuss the last Mishnah of the tractate, which can also be seen as a summation of all of Zvachim and Menachot. And the last Mishnah discusses the idea of kavanah. And it says as follows. The Mishnah says that it says with regard to sorry, one moment. It says Ne'emar be'olata behema isher reach nichoach. It says with regard to an animal isher reach nichoach, a fire offering, a pleasing aroma. And it says also regarding a burnt offering of a bird, isher reach nichoach, a fire offering, a pleasing aroma. And it says also regarding a mincha, isher reach nichoach. And what does this mean, says the Mishnah? The Mishnah says that this comes to teach echad hamarbe ve'echad hamamit ubilvad sheyichaven et da'ato lashamayim. This comes to teach that whether one brings much or brings little, so long as a person directs his intention to heaven. Meaning, we see here a few different things. First of all, we see that the Mishnah is treating Zvachim and Menachot as one unit, right? That it's all the same. Secondly, we see here the importance of kavanah, of intention, as accompanying all offerings. And we see the kavanah here in two different senses. In one sense, the Mishnah is saying what's important, don't think that what's important about korbanot is just the action, just bringing the sacrifice or the offering. But don't forget that what's also important is the intention, and the intention can be the difference between a valid sacrifice and an invalid sacrifice. And we went into this in depth in the introduction to Masechet Zvachim. But the Mishnah is also playing with the idea of kavanah and saying something else here. It's also saying that after two full tractates on all the procedures of birds and animals and plant offerings, at the end of the day, the Mishnah is saying it doesn't really matter. There isn't really a difference between them. What really matters is bilvad sheyichaven libo l'shamayim. So the person's intention is really what matters. And I think that this Mishnah gives us insight into the whole idea of Menachot, because the mincha is actually fundamentally the poor person's offering. And we could have thought about it. If we look at the verses in the Torah, we see that there's a lot more verses devoted to animal offerings than to plant offerings. And we could have seen it. The picture that could emerge from looking at the verses in the Torah is that the ideal is to bring an animal sacrifice. And only if you don't have the means, then you bring the mincha, you bring the plant sacrifice. But in various places in the tractate, and I think in the general structure of the tractate as a whole, we see that the rabbis are actually trying to make the point that the mincha is no less important than the animal sacrifice. There's a very famous drasha that's brought on page Kuf Daled of Menachot, and Rashi quotes it also on the Chumash. In this drasha, Rabbi Yitzchak says, "Mipnei ma nishtanet mincha shene'emar banefesh." Why is the meal offering singled out? That in the Torah it says nefesh. The verse says nefesh ki takriv, and Rashi actually emphasizes there that it doesn't say nefesh regarding any other voluntary offering except the meal offering. So Rabbi Yitzchak is asking, why is this? And he answers, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Midar kol avi mincha, right? The Kadosh Baruch Hu said, who typically brings a meal offering? Ani, a poor person. So, ma'aleh ani alav ki'ilu ikriv nafsho lefanai. I will consider it as if he offered his own soul before me. So some of the commentators on this verse and also on this drasha in the Talmud explain why is it that it's precisely that the ani, the poor person, is considered as though he's offered his own soul before God. Because for a rich person, when he brings his expensive sacrifice of an animal, if it's someone who's very rich, then the animal sacrifice it's okay, it's expensive, but it doesn't hurt him. On the other hand, when a poor person has to bring a mincha, he has to really reduce his own food to bring a meal offering, and therefore it's considered as though he offered his own soul before God. So in a way, both in this drasha and also more broadly throughout the Masechet, it seems that the Mishnah is actually coming to balance the biblical worldview, which seems to tilt strongly towards animal offerings. And the Mishnah is insisting meal offerings are just like animal offerings. So it emphasizes that at the end of the Masechet and says, it talks about the ani as someone who is ki'ilu ikriv nafsha, someone who is as though he sacrificed his own soul. And more broadly, we can also see that, as I mentioned earlier, that there are certain laws about the Menachot that make it in a way even more important or higher ranked than the Zvachim, like the fact that all of the Menachot are considered Kodshei Kodashim, that it can only be brought by a priest, that it can only be eaten by a priest. And the Mishnah as a whole seems to be elevating the mincha to the level of an animal offering and even emphasizing that it is perhaps even more important, because ultimately what is important is if a person's intention and a person's desire to bring the korban. We'll conclude here. Good luck, and we'll see you at the next Masechet.